All right, here is our mini lessons, three of them for lesson three. One, two, and three. There's two more after this on Vietnam stages, kind of from the beginnings to the end. America's longest running war up until that point in time. Involvement, containing communism. That's the goal of all presidents during the Cold War. But how is it that it escalates and what results in its escalation starting in 1964 and after? Our presidents involved here, as you can see, Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon. We're going to cover those individuals in these three lessons. That fellow there on the right is my boyhood neighbor, Dave Bloom, veteran of the war. Kudos to our veterans. The chart here shows what we're going to be going through in all three presidencies, but start first with a little bit of background history. Vietnam goes back into the 17th century with French involvement, French colonization, French Jesuit missionaries arriving to try to spread the Catholic faith. All kinds of conflict and resistance involving that. They control, France does, the multiple kingdoms that are there through military conquest, as many European nations did in this age of exploration, and it becomes French Indochina. With World War II occurring, Japan invades, drives out the French, drives out the Americans and the British in a lot of different places in Asia, and it creates these independent puppet states in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. There it is, right in there. This is the great empire they were trying to build. After World War II, the communist leader, Ho Chi Minh, proclaims that it is a democratic republic of Vietnam and it's independent, but the imperial powers, France, Britain, the United States, European powers, not too cool with that. And French, along with the help of British forces, reestablished control and they established the state of Vietnam. So there's this continued resistance to this, and Ho Chi Minh and the communists flee into the hills, guerrilla warfare. We've talked about this before, getting some support from China and the Soviet Union in terms of supplies. Notice where communist China is. Soviet Union way much further to the north. By this time, China had just become a communist nation in 1949, if you recall. And the United States is financing France significantly. Truman even here a little bit, a lot of it, financing France and trying to help them stay afloat and keep the communist expansion, containing communism where it is, right? It didn't work so well in 1949. It's expanded into China, and then in 1950 we have the war in Korea. But this first Indochina War really ends in 1954. The French finally saying, we're done, we're out at this Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The French are defeated by the communists, and a multinational agreement meeting occurs here at Geneva, Switzerland in 1954, and they agree, and Ho Chi Minh agrees to do this as well, to split Vietnam like Korea, right? Notice the similarities here at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam up here, China, communist influences in the north, and in about 2 years there were going to be elections with this southern government supported by the south to determine for all the people of Vietnam what their government was going to look like, and it doesn't happen. Eisenhower didn't like the idea, refused to sign the agreement, and the president that you see here on the right, Ngo Diem, his government based in Saigon in the south is supported by the United States and Eisenhower, getting military and economic aid. He was supposed to conduct and institute social reforms and operate democratically and all that kind of thing. But by 1956, he fails to hold elections and a civil war begins again. Ho Chi Minh and the communists start waging war to try to flip and overthrow the government in the South. This leader in the South here, this Diem, is very aristocratic, totally different than the common average Vietnamese citizen, Catholic. Buddhism is a pretty strong religion there in that part of the world. Pretty autocratic in his rule, kind of absolute in his power, significantly oppressed large numbers of Buddhist peasants that were in that country. The resources that were used really didn't get to where they needed to be, mostly kept at the top for him and the military. But yet Eisenhower pushes and establishes this flow of support, economic and military aid to them with the idea that we have to, otherwise Vietnam will go the way of China and possibly almost South Korea. The domino theory is expressed here with this. So domino theory begins with Vietnam, and it is, of course, an effort to try and support containment started by Truman. And this is going to be the policy in Southeast Asia, and it's going to be continually cited to the end of the war. We can't let them fall to communism. In the region, there's kind of a NATO in Southeast Asia. It's not quite the same in terms of military forces and organization, that kind of thing. But these nations here in Southeast Asia get together and they meet and they coordinate and try to support each other and trying to prevent the spread of communism to other countries in the world and to themselves, I guess, as well, and resist that movement. And so there are other NATO organizations out there, and there's one in Central America as well that we talked about. In 1955, we send the first military assistance advisory group into Vietnam under the Eisenhower administration, training the Vietnamese army to fight communists, advisors, special skills, of course, money and military weaponry support, that kind of thing. In 1959, the first 2 Americans were killed in that particular year by Viet Minh guerrillas. Notice the name Viet Minh. From the north, Ho Chi Minh. They are fighters from the north and of the north. We'll talk about the Viet Cong later. They are going to be on the same side as the communists, but they are going to be from the south. So these communist guerrilla fighters in the south, supported by Ho Chi Minh, again, are still getting support from China and from the communist world, money-wise, supply-wise. The Viet Minh Army is the army of North Vietnam, and they're funneling supplies and resources in what becomes known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail along this border with South Vietnam in the countries of Laos and Cambodia. In 1960, talking about the southern Vietnamese government there under Diem. It's a very corrupt government, and it's not supported, well liked at all. The revolutionaries conducted over 2,000 assassinations of government officials, very highly unstable. And by the time Kennedy comes around and gets voted in office, he's trying to decide, do I support this leader here? Is he really worth it at all? Or should we try to do something different? He really tries to support him as best he can, seeks to strengthen the South Vietnamese army with technology and supplies, things like that. But this is where we begin to see the flexible response. You might want to write that down here. We've talked about it before, of the Kennedy administration and coming up with flexible response, coming up with something other than the big bang for your buck nuclear weapons that Grandpa Eisenhower put a lot of emphasis on. Having big nuclear weapons doesn't do you a lot of good when you're trying to deal with people trying to overthrow a government who are basically amongst the civilian population. The Green Berets are established and sent in 1961. In 1962, the Navy SEAL Underwater Demolitions Team arrives. There's a lot of water and swampy areas where they can do some things in some ports as well along in the north of Vietnam. We'll see that's got an event connected to that a little bit later on. The CIA is helping coordinate, get Vietnamese people to help get information and to help them organize some actions there against the communists and help the South Vietnamese fight against communism. To help with this battle, there's also a battle against the environment, geography in the environment, and it's thickly forested, heavy jungles, waterways everywhere, very swampy, low-lying areas, and it's hard to see the enemy move in all this. They're under the canopy of massive, massive jungle forests, and so the United States Air Force starts using this thing called Agent Orange to defoliate the trails used by the Viet Cong forces. To expose the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this kills off the foliage, as you can see on the left, or excuse me, the right, and that way we can bomb and kill the enemy a lot easier. And this Agent Orange is a big deal yet today. If you go Google search the effects of Agent Orange, you'll see some videos and websites that talk about it being a deadly carcinogen. My neighbor has definitely been affected by that. Lots of American veterans affected by that. Significant numbers of Vietnamese people in Laos and Cambodia as well affected by that. Birth defects for the years after this event are going to occur. Under JFK, this little bit of a summary, he's basically again sending in military advisors and aid to South Vietnam, really not for combat, not supposed to be anyway, mostly for training and help organize the South Vietnamese to defend and attack communists who are coming to attack them themselves. But there's some turning points going on here in 1963. This is the year that Kennedy is going to be assassinated as well. The Buddhists element in South Vietnam. There's protests to the degree to which they protest non-violently, of course. There is a Buddhist monk, you see his name there, I won't try to pronounce it, sets himself on fire in protest of Diem's government supported by the United States. And this gets beamed across the country and across the world. This has a big impact on public opinion across the world. And what is this government doing in South Vietnam? Should the United States be supporting them? All that kind of thing. November 1st, 1963, the generals of the South Vietnamese army overthrow Diem, and they assassinate him the next day. The United States really kind of allowed it due to his corruption, didn't step in to try to save him really or anything like that. Mr. Kennedy is assassinated 3 weeks later. So in steps another president, our third president into the Vietnam experience and the escalation that's going to occur here. He keeps most of JFK's cabinet, but three individuals or two other individuals along with, to start with, there'll be one more a little bit later, that are significant to the Vietnam story here is Secretary of State Dean Rusk, who majorly supports the domino theory, and the Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who's considered to be the architect of escalating the Vietnam War during these Johnson years. And presidents here, Lyndon Johnson and Nixon, will both allude to the idea that they don't want to be the first president to lose a war, but it's under his presidency in 1964 that it's going to escalate significantly. Big topic here, big year, 1964. There's an incident, some U.S. ships, you see it right there, the USS Maddox comes under attack by some torpedo boats of North Vietnam, and they were, according to Lyndon Johnson, in a televised speech, and then his information given to Congress on the dates you see there, in international waters. And in international waters, remember Woodrow Wilson, freedom of the seas, free trade, nothing is supposed to happen to you out there. And so this was an unprovoked attack, according to Lyndon Johnson, and he basically requests some special powers from Congress to respond. He's commander-in-chief. The Constitution says that war is only declared and waged by a declaration by Congress, but this is going to be the beginning in which there is a escalation allowed by Lyndon Johnson. This Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed by Congress unanimously. You're going to read it as soon as you're done here with this video. You're almost there. And look at how it's worded and what it allows the president to do and what it references. Essentially, this is kind of considered to be, as often referenced as, the blank check in Vietnam. From here, it's going to be a president's war. So you can read through that document, ignore the 5.2 there. This is really 11.3.1. This is your left side. Go ahead and define resolution. Read the segments of it and the text-based questions that are there. You'll have a great understanding of what it's allowing the president to do and when it shall end. Super important document here for us in the Vietnam War and the escalation of the war. And from here, Lyndon Johnson will order a limited attack on North Vietnamese air bases in response. He didn't want a wider war. Remember, this is the Great Society going on in the Civil Rights Movement, and he's trying to deal with things at home. He wants to keep it contained. He doesn't want a big, wide open, crazy kind of a war. Contain communism and contain small conflicts that are used to limit communism is the goal here. He's going to use this resolution to justify expanding the war without congressional approval. Again, read what it says and what Congress is basically giving up in all this. And that ends us right here with 1964 and 65. And notice the jump from 64, Gulf of Tonkin 64, into 65. American soldiers doing the fighting in big numbers. Have a good day. Get your left side review. Get your primary document done. Finish off the haymaking with a little left side review of the essential question. You're good to go. Good day.